trying again. This failed a couple of times, but I'm here now with this stream where I'm doing my reflections on the second third of GMT Jabber and the whole project up to now. So for anyone who isn't caught up, GMT Jabber is the project that I conceived of last year, where I was going to do a single short improvisation, one of my vocal improvisations, every day for the entirety of GMT. That's Greenwich Mean Time. That's the time in the UK that we use during winter. And last year it started on the 30th of October and it will end this year on the 25th of March. So that's a total of 147 days, exactly 21 weeks. Today marked day 98, that's end of week 14, so exactly 2/3 of the way through. I did an initial reflection back on I think 17th of December, that was 1/3 of the way through, and I will do a roundup at the end, 25th of March, maybe the day after, depending how it goes. So I'm going to be relying on notes a lot, so I will be looking down. So hopefully that won't be too distracting, and hopefully also the fact that I'm having to do this portrait mode from my phone won't be too distracting either. So as I say, these are the reflections reaching 2/3 of the way through GMT Jabber. And some of these are things that I've said previously. Some of them are only tangentially related to the project itself, and some of the things are things I haven't really said previously and are relatively relevant. So to start with the basics, the duration of each improvisation being a minute is makes it both a challengingly short time for an improvisation, but at the same time it's very well suited to the way that I improvise myself. The challenge obviously is that there's very little time to get started, to interrogate an idea, and then to get out of the improvisation satisfactorily. Although, I mean, one advantage of YouTube Shorts and the fact that they loop is that it's less important how a piece ends. If the ending of the piece is broadly conformant with the rest of it, then it will just keep rolling almost invisibly. If it's quite a sharp or very noticeable ending, then it will act as a kind of punctuation or percussive element. So, you know, there's that. Now, in terms of how it's well suited to my improvisation style, when I'm doing my longer improvs, the regular weekly ones normally, which can be 10 minutes or more, I quite often will start with an idea. There'll be a sound or maybe a couple of sounds, and I'll start with that and sit with it and let it run for a while, and it'll get to a point where I think, okay, this needs to change. This has been going for a long time. And I'll start making the change, and I'll look up and I'll see the clock, and I'll have been going for maybe 40 seconds, maybe a minute 40 at most, because there's simply a lot of thought, there's a lot of concentration going on. I'm very focused on the sounds that are happening and not really keeping track of the passage of time. An example of this and how it can actually be kind of worse even than that, in the past I've used text and visual prompts for semi-improvised pieces, by which I mean I would write text, or I would have images. Usually if I wrote text, I would have suggestions of sounds or events that would happen, and there would be a sequence of them, but the exact sound wouldn't be specified. It might be something general like raw, or it might be something even more abstract than that. And there would be no indication of pitch or duration or volume or intensity, any of these things. And I would rehearse that. It would be different every time. I would rehearse it maybe 3 or 4 times, and it would come out at whatever it was, usually around 15 minutes every single time, until I came to performance in front of an audience, at which point it would be done in 5 minutes or maybe less. So that diversion aside, while I'm talking generally about my approach to improvisation, I have 3 main guiding principles that I try to keep in mind, although obviously I don't always follow them. So one of those guiding principles is, I suppose, a kind of negative principle, in that it's something I try to avoid. The other 2 are what you might call positive principles, in that they're things that I try to do as much as possible. So the negative principle, the one thing that I sort of try and avoid as far as I can, is where I would start quiet and sparse, then gradually allow the sound to get denser and louder, and sort of increase to a point until I allow it to drop back to something more skeletal, and then build up again and carry on with that cycle until the end, which is not a bad approach. A lot of people do it. A lot of people do it well. A lot of people I really like do it extremely well. It works better when there's a group of people collaborating, when there's a number of people doing it, when you have different instruments. It can work if you've got a single person with a number of sound sources, if you've got a lot of sound making objects, if you've got a laptop or tapes or whatever. I find it sometimes a little hard to concentrate on what I'm doing with my voice if I've got a lot of stuff happening with my hands. So usually when I'm performing, it is just me and it's just my voice, so it's not as easy to do this anyway, even sort of outside of my kind of personal reservations about doing it. So moving on to the positive principles, these are drawn from things that far better artists have done much better than I ever will. So from Derek Bailey, albeit unrecognisably and less successfully, and really sort of very much using a very simplified and crude version of sort of one part of his technique. I use discontinuity, or I try to use discontinuity, by which I mean discontinuity of rhythm, of tempo, of timbre, of volume, of intensity, and then again also inaccurately and not as successfully from Keiji Haino, and in particular from his percussion pieces. I'm interested in silences as active components of a piece. I often think of them as active silences. I think they can be as valuable as the sounds you're making. And at this point, it's a good moment to re-emphasize something which I have said before, but which is worth repeating fairly frequently. I'm not a musician. I can't play an instrument. I can't read music, and I definitely don't have perfect pitch. So any influences from actual musicians are going to be a very weak imitation at best. And music isn't the only source of inspiration. I've drawn inspiration from novels, from poetry, from film especially, from visual arts, performance art, theatre, and more. There were a lot of influences around me when I was a kid, many of which remain significant, some of which kind of went away and then came back. But the first things that felt truly mine from around my middle teens were first the music of the Fall, and second the films of Derek Jarman. And these were things that seemed to swim against the tide of the 1980s. They were lower budget, more personal. They existed at an angle to the mainstream, and they weren't always easy to understand, at least for me. They had strong individual voices, but they didn't seem detached from the world. They incorporated elements of it, examined and reflected them back. It was, I mean, as much as anything, the attitude and the self-possession, in addition to the actual content and the structure and form that I responded to. And I think that's remained consistent with other things that I've been interested in and remain interested in across years, especially where people challenge or break established rules and formulas. I mean, the structures that we use for any art don't seem to me to be immutable and inevitable. They didn't precede the art. They're accidental, they're contingent. They grew out of what people did in the past. They're descriptive, not prescriptive. And all of which discussion of influence, as brief as it is something I actually had to add in after writing my notes, because originally I said music was my only inspiration, and then went on to talk about something completely different. So we can go back now and pick up where I start talking about how my improvisations developed, which is something else that I started rambling on about, having indicated I was going to talk about inspiration. So I started out primarily writing poetry, and I got to these vocal sound improvisations by way of visual and sound poetry and sound art. And then by spending 3 months in China on an artist's residency where I was making visual art. So to explain, by this point I'd been making sound works consistently and frequently for getting on for 4 years. At that time that involved tapes, loops, powered sound making objects, so whether digital or just electric, lots of cables, and personally I found it really annoying. My voice was still central, but all the peripheral stuff, as I indicated previously, got in the way. At home, aside from playing around or recording, there was just too much maintenance, preparation, packing, unpacking, charging batteries, checking batteries, and all the other stuff that I just couldn't be bothered with. Making sure I knew what was on tapes, that tapes were labelled, getting stuff recorded onto tape, just a whole faff. And in rehearsal, recording or in very rare performances, although I could get pleasing results or pleasing to me, it wasn't as much fun as it should be. I felt, especially with loop pedals, like I was being lazy. And I didn't feel like I was making much progress or learning anything. I wasn't learning, I wasn't consolidating anything. I would try new ideas and new sounds vocally, and they didn't stick. My repertoire of techniques was static or even going backwards. So I started to concentrate more on the voice to work, even on my singing. Still do a little. I'm not great as a singer. I'm good enough for the times when I want to use it. But this lengthy preamble is where China comes in. Because I couldn't take my fancy sound making kit with me, it meant the only thing I had accessible to me to make sound really was my voice. I mean, obviously there was objects around the apartment I was staying in, but ignoring that, basically I had my voice. So I sung, I mimicked sounds, I did vocal exercises, I improvised, and I tried to learn new techniques. I actually obviously spent time watching videos of people listening to what they were doing, and although I didn't notice it at the time, certainly not in China, and not for months or longer afterwards, the range of sounds available to me at a moment's notice and my facility with them gradually started to expand to the point where I am now relatively confident most of the time. And that brings us up to the present. So my weekly vocal improvisations, which are now over 4.5 years in, were partly to ensure that I have at least some regular practice and don't lose ability. I don't move backwards. And likewise, the daily projects that I've done recently, so the project 31 days through August last year, and this current GMT Jabber project running from the end of October through to the end of March, which is what I'm reflecting on here, were both intended in part to increase my flexibility, especially mentally, and to try and shake myself out of established patterns and perhaps start to use a broader palette. And I think there has been some progress through GMT Jabber, which I've especially started to notice in the last 49 days, in this middle third of the project. The first of those indications of progress has been a rediscovery and reinforcement of my sense of improvisation as play. It's too easy to, or for me at least, to get into a performance or recording mode, which is like a more constrained and cautiously self-aware mode of performance. Whereas play ideally is much more free. There is obviously still self-awareness, you're still monitoring what's happening, but it's acting as less of a break, that self-awareness. It's taking a more detached role rather than trying to control what's happening. I mean, I'm aware that's a fairly imperfect description, but it's the best I've got, so I hope you're getting some idea of what I'm trying to convey there. The second of these indications of progress, perhaps more concretely, I have found, developed a technique that's new to me, although I know other people will have done it before, which is improvised singing. Specifically in this case, improvised singing where the rhythm, tempo, timbre, pitch and so forth are inconsistent and just off and a little bit wrong, or sometimes wildly wrong. It's usually incomprehensible and unintelligible, and I like it that way. I love it. It's fun to do, and it's another texture to throw into the mix. It's something that I've used in a few improvisations since I first tried it. Third indication of progress, just the accumulation of dozens of daily improvs through this project has forced me to look for newer or less familiar sounds. A lot of the time I'm more alert to interesting sounds and quicker to start utilizing them, or versions, interpretations of them, which is as good a place as any to drop in something I wanted to mention within this set of reflections, and was in the first draft that I wrote, but doesn't really fit anywhere, and this is the best place, which is to talk about borrowing ideas and techniques from other artists, which can be a relatively innocuous process to do, the kind of influence and learning that all artists have always done, especially when you're starting out. And that side of it is fine, but it can also be a problematic thing. So, for instance, where people with greater privilege steal techniques specific to more marginalized communities without acknowledgement. So, essentially what we might call cultural appropriation. Fourth and finally in these set of indications of progress, through those earlier things, through play, through accumulating sounds, and also kind of hilariously through replying to the clueless rubes that wander into my comments, I've started to care even less than I did before what people think about what I'm doing. Every so often I will now do something consciously designed to make those people who cringe and feel uncomfortable at what I'm doing cringe even harder and feel even more uncomfortable. And it's good at making you feel less self-conscious about yourself. If you're pulling stupid faces and contorting your body and looking ridiculous and making stupid sounds, then you've got nothing to be afraid of. So generally I do feel a lot happier about this middle third of the project than I did the first third. Not that I was unhappy with the first 49 improvisations, the first 7 weeks. I wasn't at all. I was quite happy with them. I'm just much happier now. I'm not entirely certain why that is, although I guess the things that I just went over contributed to that. But anyway, obviously, on a slightly more negative note, in so many improvisations, not all of them are going to be good. But maybe you learn something from a failure. And even if you don't, you just keep rolling on to the next thing, and maybe the next improvisation or the one after that or the one after that will be a genuine banger, and you might never see it coming. And I guess that resilience, that ability to keep on, is another skill that's been strengthened since I started this project, since 17th of December, when I did the first reflection on the first third of this project. And most definitely since October, when I started the project. And now, an interesting and perhaps impossible thing to contemplate for yourself, and it's maybe relevant to this, is why the things you do work or don't work. Why the things that you think work well might be of no interest to people whose opinions you respect, which I can definitely identify with, and things you think nothing of are well received, assuming that things you do are well received. I wouldn't know anything about that. And you know, in any of those cases, do you care about this? If you do care, is there anything you can or should do about it? Should you even worry about how others receive your work? And perhaps disappointingly, I don't have an answer to that, even for myself. Although I guess the facts of this project, and I'm doing this 198-day project, and my entire quote career making vocal sound improvisations, suggests that while I'm not oblivious to critique and commentary, I don't actually care all that much, and I will just press on with my bullshit regardless. So anyway, finally, before closing, I'm really happy that I've kept the project going for as long as I have, and that the end is in sight. I think I can probably complete it. Now, I did make it as easy for myself as possible, just doing short 1-minute improvisations, once a day, all first thing or as near as possible after getting up in the morning. But still, 98 daily improvisations and counting through the gloomiest part of the year it's something. It's an achievement of sorts, and I genuinely wasn't certain when I set out that I'd get this far, but I did, and there are only another 49 to go. And I think a little earlier, I said 198 in the series. Obviously, that's 197 in the series. So, pressing on. I'm not sure that I have much of a conclusion, except that the series GMT Jabber is an extension of the part of my practice that's exploratory. For me, making art has always been exploration. It's experimentation and discovery. It's a way of processing and articulating experience, a very personal interrogation of the world. I started out before I could even read and write, making marks, attempting to write, to create stories. They developed into short stories, juvenile novellas, failed attempts at novels. As a child, I wanted to be a novelist. As I got older, and I realised I couldn't for the life of me write a novel. My writing broadened out, and throughout this time I was doing other things. I was painting, not very well, and even attempted to make art that was tactile, that you felt rather than looked at, and on a couple of occasions even dabbled with smells as art, but that was even worse than other stuff that I tried. I had no sense of how smells worked. But the writing itself broadened. Usually unfinished and not very good scripts and comics, journals, appallingly bad philosophy, all of which sort of slowly began to coalesce into a much more minimal form and become poetry. And initially poetry that experimented with syntax and grammar and with dropping out some classes of words, that tried to break rules and was quite often genuinely unreadable, or where it was readable was extremely difficult to understand. Later on, after that poetry grew a little more conventional, I would incorporate images and signs and play with structure. Later still, I discovered the experimental practices that I knew all along had to be there, but I just hadn't found before. And I sort of took on concrete poetry, visual and sound poetry, and from there, by way of visual art, playing with film, sound art, even awkward dalliances with music, gradually came to my current vocal improvisations, and which over more than a decade now have continued to evolve. I try new approaches, new sounds and techniques, and have projects like this one intended to disrupt established patterns. I'm not massively consistent about all of these things. Sometimes you have fairly lax periods, and sometimes things are more intense. But it's exciting with improvisation, with projects like this, and just with my general approach to art, to not know what comes next. It's exciting to realize you don't know very much at all. You're not an expert, and that there's so much more to learn, and maybe that's the real conclusion: to remain open to change, to let the art lead you where it will, rather than trying to fit ideas into shapes that don't work for them. Listen, I'm just a silly little guy having fun making dumb noises that I can make with my mouth. It's as basic and as profound as that. And that is that. I am honestly surprised that the battery has held out on my phone for this long. I realise this won't be uploaded until some way into Sunday, so I hope when you watch this you enjoy what remains of your weekend, or whenever you're watching this. Hope this was relatively informative and interesting, and if you've got any comments, do leave them, but be aware that if your comments are stupid, I will take the piss out of you. So yeah, have a great time, and I will see you for one of my improvs or for the next set of reflections or whatever. Have a great time. I will see you soon. Bye.